All right, moving along to the next topic. Let's talk about the development environment, or the development environments, as we should say. Because again, as a Visual Studio developer, yes, we are using Visual Studio to develop stuff, but you'll probably use quite a few other tools as well to get going with your project. But let's start with the obvious one, Visual Studio 2017. Just been released March the 7th, so just a few days ago, been available as a preview version for a while. What is Visual Studio 2017? In essence, it's exactly what you think it is. It's the next version of Visual Studio. It has the typical improvements, new features, performance improvements, really cool. I really like the new performance. Like if you compare startup performance of Visual Studio 2017 with 15, drastic difference. There's new stuff in fast solution loading. So if you, like me, have very large solution files, makes a world of difference. There's also a lot of stuff that goes into the editing experience, right? So a lot of stuff that, say, in IntelliSense, you needed third-party tools for before. Now it's just built in, and then some refactorings. So like I said, a lot of the things that you would expect from a new version of Visual Studio. It also supports a lot of the new types of projects you create. Okay? So that includes, for instance, .NET Core. Okay? So you can build .NET Core applications right out of Visual Studio 2017. In fact, here is my version of Visual Studio 2017. I could just go into my new project dialog here, and you see I've installed all kinds of stuff, including .NET Core, and I could just go and build my console app just like I did from the command line before, build that right here in the development environment. Now, by the way, all these different templates and stuff that I have, they are now considered workloads, right? So there is a ASP.NET workload, there is a WPF workload for Windows development, and so on and so on. And there's a new way to install Visual Studio. Actually, I'm now supposed to call it acquisition. It's a fancy way to say installing. So when you install Visual Studio, you have much more control over what you want to install. So you can say, I want ASP.NET and I want Unity because I'm a game developer and nothing else. Or you want to say, I'm a Python developer, I still like the Visual Studio IDE, I don't want any of this Visual Studio stuff otherwise, but I want to edit Python files. So that's available too now, right? So there's all kinds of different file types that are now supported that weren't there before. TypeScript, for instance, there were better ways to edit TypeScript before, now they migrated into Visual Studio. So lots and lots of little improvements like that. The minimum install is now much smaller than it used to be, so you can kind of create a compact install if you just want to do very specific things. So those types of things are there. We'll talk about a few special features. You know, of course, Azure is very big. Angular is very big. When you do Angular development, what do you usually do? You don't have a solution file, right? Because you're not dealing with the Visual Studio solution. You're opening a folder. Visual Studio now supports opening a folder instead of solution files. So lots and lots of little stuff like that. Visual Studio 2017 is very easy to migrate to, which is nice. So there's really no reason to not move to 2017. There's only some very specialized project templates, like the project.json based .NET Core stuff that was supported in 2015 is now gone because that's just not what .NET Core does anymore. So there's little things like that, but by and large, you can do anything you can do in 2015, even 2013. I have customers that still are in 2013. When I work on their stuff, I open it in 2017. They never know, right? Because it doesn't break the project in any way. So that's kind of cool. There's actually one feature. And again, this is one of those topics, so I'd like to spend just 2 hours just on that, and I actually just wrote a lengthy article that'll be in our next issue of Code Magazine. But let me show you a quick example here of something that I really like in 2017. So I just created a simple web application here, actually just a file, new project, create a web API thing, and just picked all the defaults, right? So I created that. So that has things like this controller here, right? I've not changed the line of code. It's just the default that it creates, right? Default sample. So it has this get method here, for instance, that just returns the string value for the time being. And then what I did is I created unit tests for this. So what I can do in here is I can just right-click, say create unit tests, right? And that created this second project that I have in this file here, which is my unit test project. And it gave me the starting point for a test method here. So I went in here and I instantiate the controller, and I then just use the unit testing framework to say, hey, if I do c.get and pass the number 1, I'm supposed to get back value. Okay, and if so, then we're good to go. So far so good. You probably know all of this, right? It's typical unit testing. But check out this feature. So now we have the ability to go into the test menu, and has this live unit test item, and I can hit start here. And you see it kind of added a new column to the left of my code editor, and it just takes a moment for this to spin up and actually run. So I'm just in my code editor here, and note that it immediately says, hey, you know, this test here, all of this worked fine, so I have the check marks. I can also see over here that this code is covered by a test. Up here, nope, not so much, right? There's no test in here. So now let's say I do something in here. Let's just say I'm returning id.toString from here, right? So now you notice that the icon changed. Also notice that in the top up here, we still have the asterisk. I haven't even saved this file yet. But immediately the unit test runs and it says, hey, this is not working anymore. So I could say, oh yeah, that's true. This is really supposed to be 1. Right, and notice that I changed this and it just reruns the test, and right in the editor here it says, yep, now it works again. I never saved my code even, right? Totally live, really cool feature. Now, of course, this takes resources, and if you have a large project, maybe you may or may not want that. You can pause it, start it again, stop it and so on. So you have control over when it runs. But yeah, it's a really cool feature. Now, of course, you want to make sure you have real unit tests, not integration tests, right? If your unit test hits the database in a very slow way permanently and it keeps running this thing on every keystroke, probably not a great idea, right? But for real unit tests, I think this feature is actually a very, very cool feature to have. So this is just one example out of many that I picked as one that I think is pretty sexy in that sense. So anyway, long story short, Visual Studio 2017 is well worth getting. Not much of a reason to not get it. By the way, if you want a free version of Visual Studio, I'm always surprised how many people don't know that. There's Visual Studio Community Edition now. Now, a lot of people think, that's kind of like Visual Studio Express used to be. That was like, you could get it, but you could do almost nothing with it. No, this is essentially Visual Studio Pro. Right? So you can get that for free. You can use it for commercial users. You just can't use it as an enterprise customer. And you'd have to look into the exact details of what an enterprise customer is. I actually have a slide about that in here. But so that's something that people should be aware of. And this is not something that's like, oh, I can use it for 2 years and then I have to start paying. No, it's just a free version of Visual Studio Pro. Supports things like extensions, which was the big sticking point with Visual Studio Express in the past. So a very cool thing, and great for students, great for hobbyists, but great for professional developers because you can use it commercially as well. So that's cool. Now let's go beyond Visual Studio. Visual Studio is great, right? It's the behemoth that has 1 million features which you can now install in targeted ways. Has designers, visual form designers, database designers, workflow designers, anything and everything you can imagine. But then there are scenarios that don't call for that. There are scenarios that call for fundamentally hacking code, right? So whether that is building web apps where you write JavaScript and HTML or whatever else, right? This ability to just write code really well and have a tool that just pops up and is ready to go whenever you want to do something. And for that, Microsoft has introduced this new tool called Visual Studio Code. Okay, it's a free version of Visual Studio, so to speak, but it's not exactly like Visual Studio. It's not meant to be like Visual Studio. It's just meant to be a really good code editor. Right, so let's just fire this up here real quick. So here we go. Here's my Visual Studio Code. I think I haven't launched it today yet, so it might actually tell me there's an update, but if so, we'll just ignore it. But anyway, so here it is, and now it opened a folder for me right there. This actually happens to be an Angular 2 sample app, and it just opened that for me, and I can now poke around in here and see all the different file types. You see we have syntax highlighting, We have IntelliSense and all that sort of stuff that you would expect. And it's just a really, really good tool to edit code. So this has become super popular, especially in the web development crowd, but not just that. Okay? But certainly if you're an Angular developer, for instance, this is a great tool to use. Visual Studio Code is cross-platform. So when I made my Mac sample earlier, and I just, without saying much about it, I just went into openprogram.cs. It launched Visual Studio Code. I used Visual Studio Code to edit my C# file and closed it back down. Right? Very simple, very straightforward, opens very quickly, and like I said, works cross-platform. So that's a cool thing, because what that means is you now have an editor with which you could, if you wanted to, edit .NET Core stuff on the Mac. That's pretty cool stuff right there. But it's not just for Microsoft stuff either. Like I said, it works really well for HTML type of projects. So an Angular type of application with TypeScript, awesome. It works really, really well. Now I had another file here that I just added to my project here. It's called readme.md. So that's a markdown file, right? And in fact, if we were to look at the status bar down here, note that it says markdown right here at the bottom. So it recognized that this was a markdown file. Now by default, markdown is not something that Visual Studio Code just supports, but if you create a .md file, it'll pop up a little thing and say, hey, there's an extension you could install to edit markdown files. And it just installs that real quick, and now you're editing markdown with full syntax, coloring, and whatever the file type is, if it makes sense, there's going to be IntelliSense and stuff like that. So there is gazillions of these extensions to edit different file types. So if you're a Python guy, edit your Python files in here. If you like to do React stuff and you have that odd HTML with JavaScript format, right? There is an editor extension for that. So there's tons and tons of stuff like that, which makes this really, really good to edit anything that's text-based source files. Okay? And in fact, to give you an idea as to how much this focuses just on editing text, check this out. If I go into settings, there's no settings dialog. It's just all text, right? That's how I edit my settings. So let's say I want to change my font to be a little bigger. I just go in here, save it away, boom, there's my changed setting, right? It's everything is text files. Okay. So that's never going to change. That's the idea. Of course, somebody might write extensions that are more, I don't know, do whatever else, right? Database designer, who knows what people will come up with. But fundamentally, the idea here is to just be a really, really good code editor. And that's what it turned out to be. People love this tool. This was released maybe 10 months ago for real as a final release version. I think within the first 3 or 4 months, they had like 1 million daily users using this. Not just total downloads, 1 million daily users of this tool. So people really took to this, and it's a very nice tool to add to your tool belt. And like I said, it works cross-platform, which is really nice. So that's Visual Studio Code. And no particular reason you wouldn't install this. This, by the way, is essentially an HTML app. Kind of a little bit interesting background information. I used to always joke, like 10 years ago when we did the first fancier web apps, we're like, oh, you can do a lot with web apps now. Probably not a text editor, but you could do a lot, right? Well, that's now out the window. Now we have a full IDE, so to speak, written in HTML. It's an Atom system, essentially, and that's why it works cross-platform. So pretty cool stuff. So that's Visual Studio Code. Another thing that I want to go in here, again, not do a demo, but just mention at the very least, and that is Xamarin. Okay, do we have any Xamarin developers here in the live audience? I knew I could count on you. Perfect. So what is Xamarin? So Xamarin is this third party, or was this third party, that made tools so you could run .NET and other platforms. Originally, they did Linux. They did a Silverlight version that would run on Linux, stuff like that. But what made them big is they made tools to build .NET applications for Android and iOS. Right? That was the big thing. And that's how Xamarin attained critical mass. There's a lot of people using this stuff. And ultimately, Microsoft bought them out. So now, maybe close to a year ago or so, Microsoft bought Xamarin, maybe not quite a year. And now Xamarin is just part of Visual Studio. So you can install the Xamarin workload, right? Gives you the Xamarin features in Visual Studio. And that is why when I go into Visual Studio and into my new project dialog, notice a little small, but small point here. But we now have an Android tab and we have an iOS tab. And that's what allows me to build apps in .NET. This is not Cordova or some HTML hybrid. This is writing native .NET code and compiling it into those two environments. So it compiles exactly the same way that Java would compile for Android. It compiles exactly the same way that Objective-C or Swift would compile for iOS. In fact, you're using, under the hood, you're using the frameworks that those guys use. So you can build an iOS app using C#, but you're driving the Cocoa Touch framework with it. Right? But you're using skills you already have, you're reusing code potentially, especially if you're doing .NET Standard. And this is not just for like iPhone, right? But you could build an Apple Watch app with this. You could build an Apple TV app. In fact, you can do things with Xamarin that most people never realize, like build an app for the Mac, or build an app that targets Windows Universal. So a lot of people these days actually seem to think that rather than building a UWP app using XAML, why not build a Xamarin app for iOS, Android, and UWP? Because you can build apps that target all these different platforms, right? So when you build a Xamarin app, you can either say, I just want to do an iOS app, and I'm using the iOS objects, or I'm building a cross-platform app, and Xamarin has this abstraction layer called Xamarin Forms, and you put a text box on the screen using XAML, essentially. But then when they compile it, they say, oh, you're compiling for iOS. Let me take the iOS object that represents a text box, or let me take the Android object. And thus, you can make about 90% of what you need to do, and then the other 10% you just target build for those two or more platforms. And so with that, you can also target UWP, and now you have something that's easy enough to do to make it worth doing UWP. So that's a cool scenario. Like I said, this has long gained critical mass. Very, very interesting stuff. I know my friend Adam and the SSW guys are doing Xamarin Hack Days around the world, I think. So check that out. It's pretty cool. There's one on Saturday here, I believe, right? But is it sold out, I heard, or is it still? I think it's, well, you may have to check that, but there's more coming up, I know that for sure. So again, we don't have enough time today to really dive into that, but very cool stuff. Now, one thing I want to mention here is you can build both Android and iOS apps on your PC. But to build an iOS app, you need to have at least one Mac in your network as a build agent. That's just Apple enforcing their license, essentially. But all of us here in this room could use my Mac here as our build agent in the network, and then we could just build on Windows, including running the app. There's now a simulator that works in Windows. So that's pretty cool stuff. So that's Xamarin. Now, out of that grew something else, and that is Xamarin Studio. Xamarin Studio is a development environment for the Mac. Used to be available also for Windows, but now all that's rolled into Visual Studio. But there's the Xamarin Studio IDE for the Mac, and that's a full-blown IDE, not just a code editor, but a full-blown IDE that allows you to build Xamarin apps on the Mac, both for iOS as well as Android and whatever else they support. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Visual design and all that sort of stuff that you would expect running on the Mac. Has been available for a while, is still available to this day. But what's the news there, and what's really kind of exciting is that Xamarin Studio is actually turning into Visual Studio for the Mac. So that's a new brand that Microsoft is launching. You can now get a pre-release version for that. And that, of course, does everything that Xamarin Studio used to do, because that's essentially what it is. But they are now putting a huge amount of effort into this and turning it into more of a real Visual Studio. Now, it's not meant to be a direct copy of Visual Studio 2017 running on the Mac, but it's meant to be an IDE that appears Mac-ish, for lack of a better term, to a Mac person, right? It's not meant to drag the Windows paradigm to the Mac, but it's meant to be a native development experience on the Mac that supports .NET development, okay? So you can do Xamarin stuff, but you can now also build .NET Core apps right on the Mac with a full-blown experience. And this will just grow further. Now it won't be, let's build a WPF app and run it on the Mac, or a WinForms app, because those are just technologies that need Windows to operate, right? But the typical types of things you do, like build web apps, build services, you can now do that entirely on a Mac using Visual Studio for the Mac, which is kind of cool. So that kind of gives us an interesting overview of what the whole development environment, the whole IDE story is all about, right? We have our full-blown Visual Studio 2017, better than ever. We have Visual Studio Code for low-level and very fast code editing. And we have Visual Studio on the Mac as a full IDE to build .NET apps on the Mac. So very, very cool story now. And this goes back to what I said at the very beginning of this talk, where I said, you know, do you just allow all these other environments, or do you truly embrace all these things? And that's an example of how Microsoft embraces things, because you can now be a developer using Microsoft tools without ever touching Windows. And then you maybe take all that stuff and deploy it to Amazon Web Services. Right? That's fine if you want to do that. So there you have it. That's development environments from Microsoft, the 2017 generation, I suppose.